I was standing in the aisle. I heard this noise. There was a man with a gun. He told everyone, "Put your hands up, this is a hijack." I tried to tell myself somebody would die, but it didn't have to be me. You're looking around trying to find somebody who's in a worse position than you are. The leader came down the aisle and just took somebody out of an aisle seat, took him forward, negotiated over him for about half an hour, and then shot him and threw him out of the plane. I felt sick to the bottom of myself. As I stood up, I said what might well have been my last words, which were, "For fuck's sake." I said, "Please don't hurt me." I went round in my mind and said goodbye to the people that I would miss. The leader came and so he looked down at me. He said, "Are you all right? Would you like a drink?" He said, "I would like to go out drinking, go out dancing, go out with women." There was this daka, 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 a machine gun. I remember doing a zigzagging run and thinking, this must be a dream. My name is Mike Thexton and I'm the survivor of a plane hijacking. My brother Peter was a doctor and a mountaineer. He did exciting things. He went off on expeditions to the Alps, to the Himalayas. He always came back with great stories. And I was training to be a chartered accountant. In 1983, he went on an expedition to Pakistan to climb K2. I was doing my final exams, and a week after I had done my final exams, the phone rang at 7 o'clock in the morning. It was my mother, and she said, "I'm terribly sorry that Peter has died." I was shattered. In 1986, some of the medical students from the medical school where he trained to be a doctor told our family, well, that we're going to go on an expedition in his honour. They would go to Pakistan and to try and climb the last peak that he successfully got up, and they asked me if I would like to go. This was a thing that I had sort of vaguely dreamed of doing, going to the bottom of the mountain and saying goodbye. As far as I know, he is buried in a crevasse at 24,000 feet up the mountain. There's no way that I could get to see the actual place. So my intention, my plan, was to go to the foot of Broad Peak, look up the mountain and recite a poem that I'd written for him, which he would probably have been bemused by, I think. Walking to the bottom of Broad Peak involves probably about 100 miles of walking. It takes 6 or 7 days, and I can remember sort of cowering from the midday sun under rocks, drinking the last of my water and wondering how far it was to the next camp. So when we got back to the first civilized place in northern Pakistan on the walk out of the mountains, I found 14 pieces of post that had not made it up to base camp. And there was one from the people that I worked for at the time. I was teaching accountants. It said, "We're looking forward to you being back at work on this particular date." And I worked out that that was actually the day that we were going to get home. And so I spent the morning of the 4th of September, Thursday the 4th of September, going around all the airline offices in Rawalpindi trying to find an earlier flight. So the only place that could give me a ticket was Pan Am. The woman in the Pan Am office said, "Yes, we have one business class seat." And it was a cheapskate expedition. I probably spent more than the entire expedition had spent on food for 8 weeks on this one ticket. And then she arranged for me to get from Rawalpindi in northern Pakistan to Karachi, overnight stay in a hotel, and I was supposed to catch the plane out at 6 o'clock the following morning from Karachi. I was just really looking forward to it, and looking forward to being home, surprising my family who weren't expecting me back until the following week. I went up to the front door and I put the big bag on this enormous seat, which looked extremely luxurious, and I opened the bag to get a book out. I was still standing in the aisle. I heard this noise in the second doorway. There was a man struggling with a flight attendant. He was dressed as a Pakistani civilian. So he had what they call a Patani suit on, and a gun. He had a handgun, and he had his arm wrapped round her neck. She had an intercom in the hand, and they were struggling. And I had what I believed to be a fairly typical civilian reaction to this, which was just to gawp at him. I just thought, oh, it's a man with a gun. Extraordinary. Immediately afterwards, there was a noise in the door that I'd just come in by, so I turned round and there was a man in uniform. He had a big rifle. My immediate reaction was, maybe this is some sort of domestic riot, and the man in the uniform is here to protect me against the man in the second doorway. Of course, I completely wrong. There were 4 of them. They had managed to make 3 security guards' uniforms, and I don't know why they weren't all dressed as security guards, but one of them was dressed as a civilian. I was looking at this man who had a complexion that could have come from anywhere from North Africa to the Bay of Bengal to me, and I didn't want him to be an Arab. In the 1980s, there had been a number of different hijackings. They were usually related to the situation in the Middle East in some way. So there would be the PLO or the Abu Nidal organization, and usually the targets were Westerners. I thought, if he is an Arab, that is my problem. If he is a Pakistani, then with any luck, it is not my problem. I had this moment sort of staring at the man in the second doorway, and then the noise from the front doorway, turned round, and there was the man in the security guard's uniform with his big rifle, saying, "Get down, get down." And my first thought was, he's going to take a shot at the man in the second doorway. That's what he's there for. And I'm in the way with 14 kilos of hand luggage on my seat. So I tried to get down, but then he was shouting at the flight attendant and saying, "Close the door, close the door." And for a moment I thought, okay, that's still all right. That's a problem outside the plane. That's these Pakistanis that are having a domestic riot. And then she wouldn't do it, so he threatened her with the gun. And that's when I started to think, that's not right. There's something wrong, going very wrong here. And then very shortly after, she closed the door, and then he told everyone, "Put your hands up, this is a hijack." I tried to tell myself, hijacks happen, but people go home. Somebody would die, but it didn't have to be me. I thought, I will do what I'm told. I will keep my head down, try and remain inconspicuous, in spite of the fact I'm wearing this red jacket, which is quite conspicuous. But if I do what I'm told, I should be all right here. Very quickly, we were moved back from the business class to the front economy cabin, and there were people sitting on the floor, everybody crammed together. I found a seat, and there was a Pakistani man sitting on the floor beside me. I remember him whispering to his daughter in English, because I could understand it. He whispered to his probably teenage daughter, "It will be all right, inshallah, God willing." It occurred to me afterwards that he was looking at me and thinking, he's in front of us. He's a Westerner. This is his problem more than us. I was looking at 2 people beside me who I thought looked like they were Americans, and I thought, they're in front of me. And it's a sort of brutal thing. You're looking around trying to find somebody who's in a worse position than you are. We sat there with our hands in the air, waiting to see what would happen. And of course, what we all assumed would happen was the plane would take off. But the announcements that were made were all made by flight attendants. There was no American voice of the pilot talking to us on the intercom. It gradually dawned on me that the pilot, for some reason, wasn't there. They had bailed out of the cockpit. They'd been warned by the flight attendant in the second doorway that there was a hijack going on, and they had escaped. And as soon as I realised that they weren't there, I just felt this enormous sense of relief, that we're not flying anywhere. That would be terrifying. They spent probably 2-3 hours of that morning trying to work out what to do. You know, their intention to fly somewhere else had been frustrated. But after a while, the leader came down the aisle on my side of the plane and just took somebody out of an aisle seat. An Indian man. He happened to be an American green card holder, but there was no way of telling that just by looking at him. But he took him out of the seat, took him forward, negotiated over him for about half an hour, and then shot him and threw him out of the plane. At that point, they made an announcement. One of the flight attendants made an announcement. Ladies and gentlemen, please hold your passports up and they will be collected. I took my passport out and I held it up. But I was still thinking, it's a Pan Am plane. There will be Americans in that bag, and they're in front of me. The Indian flight attendant, Sunshine, had this. She was just an extraordinary woman. She was just extraordinarily brave and, I mean, to an extent, bloody-minded. You know, she thought, I am not going to give him an American. No, he's going to kill an American. She knew that that was what he intended by collecting the passports. So, as she went down the aisle, if people handed her an American passport, she didn't put it in the bag. She dropped it or gave it back to them. But even more than that, and I only found this out 20 years later, she actually decided that he wouldn't believe it if there were no American passports at all. And so she put in the bag American passports with Indian and Pakistani names and faces, and rejected the white ones. She took it back and emptied it all out, and she was told to sort out the Americans, and she was able to show them, oh no, this was an Indian or Pakistani. And he was furious. But he also it didn't occur to him that she might have done that. And so he said, pick a Brit. There was an announcement, ladies and gentlemen, will Mr. Michael John come to the front of the plane? I felt sick to the bottom of my soul. As I stood up, I said what might well have been my last words, which were, for fuck's sake. And I've always thought that my mother might have asked, did he have a final message for us? That would have been it. And I walked forward and I said, that's me. The leader, he had the Kalashnikov hanging around his neck. He was standing there with a big pile of passports at his feet, my passport in his hand. And he questioned me. He actually said, what is your name? I said, Michael John Thexton. He said, where are you from? I'm from London. Then he said, are you a soldier? And I said, no, I'm not a soldier, I'm a teacher. He looked me in the eye, said, do you have a gun? And I burst out laughing. I mean, I was probably close to hysterics of the uncontrollable kind. And I just said, no, I haven't got a gun. You've got all the guns around here. And he'd said, kneel here. I said, please don't hurt me. My brother died in the mountains and my parents have no one else. And he simply waved a hand as if to say, I'm too busy for that. Kneel here. And just put his hand on my shoulder and made me kneel behind the door. He got one of the flight attendants to stand in the doorway. It was open just a sort of crack. And she spoke to a man who was down on the runway below the plane. He said, tell him that if anyone comes near the plane, if any US troops come near the plane, we will kill one body immediately. Obviously me. I think I was called forward at about 9 o'clock, 9:30, and it all came to an end probably about 12 hours later. And it's a strange thing, sort of very little happened. For most of the day, everybody just sat there and had to wait. They used to play sort of plinky-plonky music as you were waited to take off on an intercontinental flight. And it's on an endless loop. And so we sat there with our hands in the air, the hiss of the air conditioning, and the entertainer playing in the background. Da 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 da, ba 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 ba. again and again and again. It was wearing. You know, there were times at the front of the plane where I lay down and slept. And people say, how could you sleep? Well, I was exhausted. It's actually quite wearing being that frightened for that long. I felt so sad for my parents, you know, and so I whispered to one of the flight attendants, I said, please tell my family that I love them very much. And she tried to sort of tell me to shush, but I felt better for saying that. I went round in my mind and said goodbye to the people that I would miss. I got round to thinking that I didn't want to die angry with them. I didn't want to die afraid of them. And it was, I suppose it was to do really with the sort of the films that I had watched and loved and the comics I read as a child. You know, I sort of felt that I knew how a British gentleman should behave in this circumstance. That if they said, right, we're going to shoot you now, I was going to be very stiff upper lip about it and say, okay, do a decent job, you know, I forgive you. When the leader had gone upstairs, I could just about hear them talking on a radio. Another man came down from upstairs and stood guard over me and the 4 flight attendants. This guy was probably 17 or 18. He was aggressive, he was jumpy, he was quite scary. You know, I thought that he would possibly just shoot me for fun, and that would hurt. Whereas I felt if the leader decided to shoot me, then he would shoot me and I would be dead. After a while, the leader came back down the stairs, so obviously some sort of break in the negotiations, and he looked down at me and said, are you all right? Would you like a drink? And of course, you know, again, being British, I just said, oh yes, I'm fine, thank you very much, never better. And he said, do you want some beer, some whiskey? I said, oh, just a glass of water, some 7-Up. So he said to the flight attendants, bring him a drink. And at that point, it seemed more relaxed. The leader, I mean, he hadn't got what he wanted, but he was at least having a conversation with the people in the control tower. And so I moved to sitting on the floor. There was one point where the flight attendants were down the plane. The leader sat down opposite me. I was sitting on the floor looking at him. And he turned to me and he said, are you married? I said, no, I'm not married. I have a girlfriend. He said, I'm sorry about this. I'm sorry for this fighting and this killing. I would like to go out drinking, go out dancing, go out with women. But the Americans and Israelis have stolen my country. And without my country, these things are no good. And so finally I tweaked. I said, so you're Palestinian then? I have to say, I felt sorry for him. Now, I'd like to say I felt no sympathy at all for what he was doing. What he was doing was wrong. And what he was doing was also just going to make things worse. But in that moment, I thought, this is a man who feels that there is something terribly wrong, and he feels that he has to do this to try to put it right. And that's really sad. And that is different from a man who just likes mayhem and murder. There was one moment, the leader was sitting, chatting up is the right description. He was trying to chat up the 4 flight attendants, telling them they were very brave, very beautiful. I saw the man in the Patani suit walking up the aisle towards us, and he had in his hand a hand grenade, and he had the pin around his fingers with his cigarette. And he came up and he looked disapprovingly at the leader. I think he was perhaps a slightly more strict Muslim, and he felt that the leader was flirting with these short-skirted women, and this was wrong. He leaned down and he showed me his grenade, and I said, okay, grenade. And then he turned around and walked back and went into the toilet. A moment later, an alarm went off. Bah, bah, bah. And this sort of happy chat was over. The leader jumped to his feet with his gun. He said, what is happening? What is happening? He obviously thought that the commandos were storming the plane. And one of the flight attendants simply stood up and said, don't worry, he's smoking in the toilet. He set off the fire alarm. And she went back and she opened the door and she said, oh, I'm terribly sorry, and turned this alarm off, averting her eyes. And it was comic. I had fallen asleep and I was woken up by the young man kicking my feet. And I mean, a strange thing is that's the only vaguely rough physical treatment I had had all day. He was kicking my feet and saying, "Up, up, move," waving a handgun at me. Picked myself up, still a bit foggy from the sleep, and thought it's hotter and darker. The air conditioning had stopped. It was getting darker, the lights were going down, the music had stopped, which was welcome. I was moved back into the body of the plane and I saw a window seat a little bit in front of the wing exit. I could see a door, and I got into this window seat, sat down and thought, I'm back with the others. I stand a chance. And while that thought was just going through my mind, there was this daka, 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 a machine gun being fired at the front of the plane. And then faint noise of a machine gun being fired at the back of the plane. Daka, daka, daka. The noise stopped. And I lifted my head up enough to see across the plane, in this darkness, there was a different colour of darkness, and it was door-shaped. And I could see the night sky out there. And I felt for the man beside me, and I said, "There's somebody's opened the door. We've got to go." And he pushed me back and said, "No, keep down, dangerous." So I pushed him out. I got out the aisle, and I could see that the port wing exit a few rows behind me was also open. And so I made for it and jumped out, short distance down onto the wing. And the chute had not come down. And there I was on the wing. I was the only person, it seemed, who got out onto the port wing. Lots of people went out onto the starboard wing, but there I was on my own in the dark. I thought I would slide off the back of the wing, dangle from my fingertips, and drop what I was convinced would be a couple of feet to the ground. And I just hadn't looked at a jumbo jet that carefully ever. It's a very long way down. I landed, hit the ground quite hard, picked myself up and ran away. And I remember doing a zigzagging run and thinking, this must be a dream. I can't possibly have got out of that. It became part of my life to tell this story, and that went on for 15 or 16 years. And then immediately after 9/11, there was this surprising piece of news that the Americans had arrested one of our hijackers. Now, the hijackers had all been captured within the airport perimeter at the end of the event. And put on trial in Pakistan, sentenced to death. It was commuted to life. And after they had served 15 years of a life sentence, they were eligible for parole. And the leader was deported in September 2001, just after 9/11, to Thailand, where he found the FBI were waiting for him. And they took him to Alaska and then to Washington. In 2004, he was put on trial. I went to that sentencing hearing. I couldn't not go and look at him and see what the years had done to him. The whole experience of that, and seeing the man sent down for 160 years, what they sentenced him for, led me to write a book about it. So at the trial, or the sentencing proceeding in Washington, I noticed an elderly Indian couple sort of pointing at me, and they said, "It's him, it's the hippie man." They said, "We were sitting 2 or 3 rows behind you when you were called forward. We didn't know, who you were, but our 3-year-old daughter was so obsessed with you. She kept asking us afterwards, what happened to the hippie man? Was the hippie man all right? The long hair and the beard and so on, and the ragged clothes." And I was so touched that, this little girl in her, this terrifying experience, that she was worried about some ragged Englishman. So, what happened to the hippie man? That was what we called the book. Then, at the beginning of the first lockdown, March of 2020, I got this email that said, we're going to make a documentary about your hijack. Would you like to be involved? The director, he came and sat at my kitchen table and he said, I have been in touch with the terrorist in the American prison, and he has said he will talk to you if you're willing to talk to him. Said, I don't want to give him a voice particularly, but if there are questions that you want to ask him, then he will talk. I thought, well, I'm not going to get another chance to do this. There are things that I want to know. And so they came, and standing in my kitchen, I had to wait for him to call on the director's mobile phone, with me sort of terrified I'm going to press the wrong button and cut him off. He phoned and I said, hello, Zaid, it's Mike. And he said, oh, Mike, my friend. And this was just very, very bizarre. And I said, I've always wondered, if you were going to open fire, you could have just shot me there. Why didn't you shoot me? He said, it was what you said about your brother. He said, it touched my heart. I was completely unprepared for that. It had never, ever occurred to me, not in the remotest way, that he was even listening. He had seemed to be too busy to take any notice of what I said. The thought that he would remember it 12 hours later, let alone 20 plus years later, I was just amazed. It started with my brother and it ended with my brother.